Okay. I am honored to introduce John Waterbury, the 14th president of the American University of Beirut. Even among professors of political science, who are widely celebrated for their tremendous intellects, superior powers of administration, and brilliant introductory speeches, John Waterbury is a towering figure. His scholarship has enhanced the discipline of political science and the reputation of the American University of Beirut. But just as important as his scholarly contributions are his contributions to a sense of normalcy here, a tall order following a 15-year civil war. Those of us lucky enough to have been at AUB during President Waterbury's tenure remember his regular jogs on the university campus, something that was once an unthinkable security proposition. And while his security detail might have preferred a more sedentary president, ideally a president with a taste for cigarettes and cards on the Oval, his runs put the world on notice that AUB was once again running full throttle. And thanks to his legacy, it has not missed a step since. Were it not for John Waterbury's leadership and commitment to higher education, the university would have far less to celebrate today. Please join me in welcoming President John Waterbury.
Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back, see so many familiar and friendly faces. I have to warn you, I have a cold, and it may interrupt my remarks at certain points, but it's the best kind of cold. I got it from my grandchildren. So please bear with me. I think I'm going to repeat some of what Patrick McGreevy had to say, and so I apologize for that, but I think that's always the risk of bringing us together on the same topic from so many different places. The term liberal arts describes a very big tent. It suggests a broad understanding of history and culture, the ancient Greek ideal of a sound mind and a sound body, familiarity, if not mastery, of a broad range of analytic techniques, a commitment to choice in the pursuit of education, a Socratic or dialectical approach to the way we learn, and the building of citizens in a democratic order. 39 years ago, in October 1977, AUB and the Faculty of Arts and Sciences held a symposium on the liberal arts. One of the participants summed up his understanding of the university's role in liberal arts education. The university, he said, may contribute to society by providing students the ability to communicate orally and in writing, the capacity for careful analysis, i.e. to identify the issues in a complex problem, collect relevant data, marshal the pertinent arguments, test every contention, and formulate conclusions related to the data and the arguments. The acquisition of quantitative methods, languages of thought like statistics, computer sciences, and calculus, the ability to speak a foreign language, the knowledge of an academic discipline, and above all, learning how to learn. The competence to read systematically about a topic, to comprehend what is read, to arrange the knowledge acquired in a coherent pattern, and to evaluate what is learnt through the application of critical thought." End of quote. Those words came from the late Nadim Khalaf, then professor of economics at AUB. I would add only one observation to Khalaf's summary. A liberal arts education is premised on the exercise of choice. It assumes we do not know where we are headed, that there is a vast array of knowledge to which we might have access, and that for some substantial part of our undergraduate education, we have to choose the path or paths we wish to follow. The obligation of choice is in turn premised on the idea of self-discovery, that in choosing we may discover talents we did not know we had, interests that had been suppressed or hidden. Choice is also related to responsibility. We may choose badly, but will nonetheless have to live with the consequences. Choice can be liberating, but it can also be terrifying. In 1977, when Nadim Khalaf wrote, we were in the later years of a revolutionary era. Mao Zedong had died only a year earlier. The Viet Cong had triumphed in Vietnam. Russia was still Soviet. The PLO was still a liberation movement. The philosophy of liberal arts seemed quaint, detached from the processes of the real world, a relic probably headed for the dustbin of history. It never had really dominated anywhere outside the Anglo-Saxon world, and perhaps not outside Oxford, Cambridge, and the Ivy League. It is something of a surprise that it still seems to have plenty of life in it. Sexton, the former president of New York University, built the entire mission of NYU on carrying the liberal arts to the four corners of the globe. Despite its resilience, liberal arts education has always been contested, implicitly or explicitly. One of the prides of the U.S. was the establishment of the land-grant universities in the mid-19th century after the U.S. Civil War. These grew out of the Morrill Act of 1862, and it set the mission of the land-grant universities, many of which are familiar to you all, many of which were attended by some of you, Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska, and so on. They were designed to provide education, to quote the Act, without excluding other scientific and classical studies and including military tactic, to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the mechanic arts in such manner as the legislatures of the states may respectively prescribe, in order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions in life." End of quote. It is, of course, merely an interesting coincidence that the Syrian Protestant College was born a year after the promulgation of the Morrill Act, but in many ways its spirit reflected that act. The Morrill Act implicitly recognized that existing liberal education was elitist, available mainly to the small privileged strata of society that could afford a university education. That tension between the elitist preparation of the nation's leaders and the provision of practical, job-related education for the masses persists until today. I doubt that it will ever be resolved, and I believe that that tension is healthy. It forces us constantly to review the premises of what we do in higher education, just as we are doing here today. The great German universities that Patrick mentioned of the late 19th century offered a different model and a different mission, one built around the creation of knowledge and the education of doctoral students. It was not hostile to the liberal arts, but rather emphasized other priorities. In the U.S., MIT and Johns Hopkins universities were inspired by this model. Now, almost 40 years after AUB's 1977 symposium, liberal arts is once again seemingly on the brink of irrelevance. This time, it is not revolution, but rather the knowledge economy that appears to be its enemy. The condemnation is not so sweeping this time around. Liberal arts education is not dismissed as useless, but rather as a distraction, contributing to the soaring costs of higher education and irrelevant to the needs of society. Under present trends, it seems we are tending toward a kind of Platonic elite that benefits from solid practical education in engineering, medicine, economics, the social sciences, and the service of the mind, body, and spirit that the ancients felt was needed to mold the well-rounded man or woman. Just as the university teaching profession is increasingly bifurcated into tenure-track, full-time, versus the ever-expanding ranks of the part-time, non-tenure-track adjunct, so too is higher education as a whole moving toward a two-tiered system, whereby elite research universities supply the leaders of society and the economy, while practical professional schools and vocational colleges provide the skilled resources that rapidly changing economies require. The only remaining bastions of almost pure liberal arts education are a handful of undergraduate colleges, like Swarthmore, that enroll a tiny fraction of those in tertiary education. We add to all this the fact that students are increasingly called upon to finance their own higher education by taking on debt. This means that every credit hour becomes an investment. Any rational student, or his or her parents, will ask, what is the return for each additional credit hour? They will know the cost in terms of increments of debt. But can proponents of the liberal arts assure them of the returns to a liberal education? If the basic proposition is that a liberal arts curriculum will add, say, a year to the length of university education, are we surprised that students and parents question the utility of the added time? I will revisit some economic issues toward the end of my remarks. Within our assessment of liberal arts education, there is, it seems to me, a false debate about instrumental knowledge and knowledge for its own sake. Amy Gutmann, noted social scientist, political scientist, now president of the University of Pennsylvania, wrote a very good book some 20 years ago called Democracy in Education. And she summarized the proposition of these in these words. All members of a genuine academic community must be dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, not only because no higher purpose exists, but also because all other purposes, such as professional education, prevent scholars and students from searching for the most fundamental form of knowledge, which is metaphysical rather than practical. Amy Gutmann was summarizing a school of thought or a view on higher education. She was not necessarily endorsing that. I doubt that many students and parents of students or taxpayers would accept that they have to pay for metaphysics. Perhaps they are short-sighted, but I have never doubted that the case for liberal arts education would have to be made to them in more mundane cost-benefit terms. In the final analysis, I believe that the goals of liberal arts education are instrumental. Understanding our intellectual heritage was never a goal in itself, but rather an instrument to make us better citizens and to protect our institutions. Learning how to think critically is not for our mental amusement, but rather to make us more useful and effective citizens, economic agents, friends, and family members. Liberal arts education is not only relevant to, but supportive of one's professional life and one's livelihood. It is about instrumental learning and knowledge, not for its own sake, but because it can help us achieve, as individuals or as a society, other desired goals. What I am about to say is almost cavalier in its brevity and its superficiality. It concerns a question which must be paramount in the mind of any educator. What is the impact of what we teach? Even if we could all agree on what constitutes a liberal education, even if we could all agree upon its benefits, how would we assess our efforts? An even broader question is, can we teach values? As parents, we certainly try to teach values. Judging from my own experience, I definitely learned some values from my parents. I am not sure what values I learned through schooling. I know I learned a great deal through experience, how I was treated by school authorities, what I learned from peers and so forth, but I am not sure I learned much by way of values from being lectured to. So everything I have to say about a liberal arts education has to be placed in a context of skepticism. In my first teaching position at the University of Michigan in 1968, I had as a colleague in the political science department Kent Jennings. Kent was studying the impact of high school civics classes on the civic values of students who took such courses and a control group that did not take them. As I recall, he found no significant difference between the target group and the control group. In other words, the civics classes had failed to enhance civic values and understanding among those taking them. Over the years, I have met so many people who have not had exposure to a liberal arts education, but who exhibit all the skills of critical thinking, sharp analytical abilities, and mastery of oral and written presentation, that I wonder if such attributes reflect character types rather than formal educational experience. Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard from 1869 to 1909, a period of time that just boggles my mind, is alleged to have said, "We admit the brightest students in America and we try not to do them too much harm while they are here." That modesty may be well placed. This is not to say that a liberal arts education has no impact, but rather that it may be more the result of living experience than of formal study. For instance, we may learn about important values when our university, any university, is not faithful to them. In 1882, Edwin Lewis, a respected member of AUB's or the SPC's faculty, expressed respect for Charles Darwin and his theories of evolution. His views crashed against an institutional commitment to the literal truth of the Christian Bible. Lewis was forced to resign from the faculty. What an unintended learning experience that must have been for AUB's students or SPC students at that time. Prime Minister Hariri met with me on one occasion to discuss some problems the university was facing. He was, as many of you know, a trustee of the university. He said to me, "John, you know Lebanon is not Plato's republic." I doubt that any of you would dissent from that view. Our students and faculty have always faced a fairly stark contrast between the values we try to embed in our liberal arts education and the reality of politics beyond our walls. Do we step out on Bliss Street and leave behind the values we were taught inside? Did those values make a strong impression upon us in the first place? I do not know the answers to those questions. If the formal content of university education does not matter very much, if one's university education is nothing more than a signal to prospective employers or to graduate schools that you are a committed student of a certain quality, then all this discussion of the liberal arts education is beside the point. But I do not accept that higher education is only about signaling. I think content counts, and that therefore the structure of that content is very important. Think of Nadim Khalaf's components: analytic thinking, critical thinking, the structure of an argument or a case, understanding evidence and data, being familiar with replicability in scientific experiments, and so forth. 16 years ago, we revived and revised at AUB our general education requirements. At that time, we talked of exposing all our undergraduate students to modes of learning and fields of knowledge. We wanted each student to be exposed to lecture courses, seminars, writing-intensive courses, laboratory courses, and ideally, research design courses. We also wanted them to be exposed to the broad disciplinary concerns of the university's faculties. Our hope was that general education requirements would be met early in the academic experience rather than at the end. In that way, the exposure to modes of learning and fields of knowledge would have the greatest likelihood of influencing choices of majors. The premise was that how we as humans think about problems is as important as the problems themselves. But we need to understand both. At that time, I used a phrase, surely not of my own invention, that it is not what you know, but how you think that counts. But for what or for whom does it count? One component Nadim Khalaf did not mention, and it is an elusive concept, is the flexibility, adaptability, and inquisitiveness that should flow through the veins of a liberal arts education. I think this takes us back to the element of choice and taking responsibility that is so central to a liberal arts education. We analyze, or we should analyze, our choices. We adapt to the consequences of them, and we move on and we move ahead. An employer who does not cherish all such traits is probably an employer you would not want to work for, even if it is yourself. And employers recognize this. Fareed Zakaria, in his recent book In Defense of Liberal Arts Education, emphasizes that many employers feel that students they interview and sometimes employ have not had enough liberal arts education in the sense of deep familiarity with modes of thought and analysis. They do not have the tools to write and convey their analysis of the problems they confront in their work. Zakaria notes, rightly I think, that employers find not only that prospective employees have not mastered the skills of critical thinking, they have not developed the discipline to cope with the challenges of their professional life. I recognize that what I have said leaves me open to criticism from some voices that Patrick McGreevy mentioned of what I would call, perhaps unfairly, the old order or of a utopian past. One such voice is that of William Deresiewicz, who bemoans so-called neoliberal trajectories at contemporary universities. My endorsement of instrumentalism could put me squarely on the path to neoliberalism. In his book, Excellent Sheep, Deresiewicz laments that in the last 30 years, U.S. universities have replaced the traditional quest for enlightenment with the goals of late capitalism, in which he includes consumer sovereignty, labor market flexibility, scientific management, and the role of technology in shaping human productivity. The U.S. university, he claims, has sacrificed a commitment to larger causes while legitimizing selfish pursuit of individual goals. The university has jettisoned the ideal of service. I suppose that Deresiewicz might see the rise of Donald Trump as a logical outcome of this trend. I am more than a bit skeptical that in an earlier period, universities were focused on liberal enlightenment and service. Many of the finest universities in the U.S. seem to have lived more or less comfortably with slavery. As mentioned, AUB in 1882 forced the resignation of Edwin Lewis for having referred favorably to Charles Darwin for his scientific method. My father went to Princeton University at the time of the First World War. He served in the military and then made a career on Wall Street. That's what graduates of Princeton often did in that allegedly golden era. He had no women as classmates, hardly any Jews, and no blacks. Have things really become worse since then? I attended Princeton in the 1950s. Then the university's motto was, Princeton in the nation's service. Beyond that motto, I never heard anything about service. Perhaps I wasn't listening. In short, universities are always at risk of compromising their values, of wandering off mission. But that can provoke healthy debate within the walls and with key actors in society. For example, Fareed Zakaria, a graduate of Yale, worries about the rise of the research university, a status to which AUB aspires. Zakaria notes that the incentive structure in research universities pull the faculty away from teaching and interaction with students and into their labs and into grant applications. Yes, indeed. But universities as communities are aware of these tensions, and if we make poor choices, it won't be for lack of information and space for debate. Let me return to the issue of the liberal arts and instrumental knowledge. There are issues facing us all that are not abstract, not confined to ivory towers. They are issues none of us can afford to leave for others to analyze, let alone solve. There is a solution to every problem, but often the solution is bad. As educated citizens, we need to engage in the search for better, if not for the best solutions. Many of the problems we face as citizens and economic agents raise fierce ethical questions that none of us should avoid. Can one really not have an opinion about global warming? How do we feel about the right to privacy? And how is that right shaped by modern technology? How do we feel about artificial intelligence that could replace whole swathes of human workforces from call centers in India to law offices in New York? How do we feel about drone warfare? Are there legitimate and illegitimate targets? Who gets to decide? Should we genetically engineer the body to overcome illnesses and deformities, or perhaps simply to make ourselves more beautiful, handsome, and wrinkle-free? Should we genetically modify human embryos for similar reasons? Do we eat or use GMOs? Do we care? I am on the board of ACS, the American Community School, and I recently visited an 11th grade International Baccalaureate class. It involved a web-supported debate about ethics. The issue was strategic bombing, in which innocent civilians, say women working in munitions factories, were killed. Is such bombing morally acceptable? Are women, or men for that matter, innocent if they work in munitions factories? Can civilian collateral damage, and the students in this class use that term easily, be justified if it hastened the end of the war and thus perhaps saved lives? The students voted at the beginning of the class, then did online reading for 20 minutes. Then each of the 5 or 6 tables of students debated what they read and came to conclusions that they shared with the class. Then they voted again. There was a significant shift. The discussion was great, quite sophisticated and nuanced, frankly as good as what I remember from leading sections at Princeton. One girl said, even if strategic bombing saves lives by hastening the end of combat, who is morally empowered to make that judgment? Maybe the war would end soon anyway. Who has the power and right to condemn innocent victims or any victims? That from a 16-year-old. Students used examples ranging from World War II to Israeli bombing of Gaza. One student apparently had a grandmother or great-grandmother who had survived Nagasaki. These are issues that impact us in our daily lives. Someone has to worry about them, understand the history and the context in which they manifest themselves, and link them to the enduring philosophical debates that define our human heritage. Someone with a liberal arts education should be better equipped to enter into and shape these debates than someone without such an education. Plato worried about leadership. He clearly saw it as a process of education. The nurturing of mind and body and soul would make for excellent leaders. But would they be good leaders? Moral, sacrificing, devoted, far-sighted, just. Maybe all the talent would be put to bad purposes. Who guards the guardians? He had no way out of this, but probably saw what we would today call a liberal arts education as the framework for self-enforcing good governance. We can try to teach people to have internal compasses that keep them moving in the right ethical directions. But this means the liberal arts education is mainly for governing elites. And I think for decades, if not centuries, from Oxford to Harvard, that was its purpose. I read recently about NYU's campus in Shanghai. There, students are not bound by China's restrictive use of social media. There are no political red lines within its walls. Students there, many of whom are mainland Chinese, may debate hot issues openly. Why would the Chinese authorities allow this when they have been multiplying restrictions on political debate in recent years? The answer appears to be they want a supply of innovative, agile thinkers who can join, if not lead, China economically as it faces new challenges in the international division of labor and production. They want an elite, and they want NYU to share in its training. They gamble that they can control it once it is integrated into society and into the economy. That is not the kind of elite Plato envisaged, nor did Thomas Jefferson, the founder of the University of Virginia, nor Benjamin Franklin, the founder of the University of Pennsylvania. The latter two believe that a liberal arts education should be available to a fairly broad stratum of adult society. Indeed, they felt that such education would be crucial for educating citizens with a capital C. Such citizens are necessary to sustain democracy. They must understand and embrace its philosophical underpinnings and also understand the basic mechanics, its checks and balances. If all that universities did was to produce professionally trained additions to the skilled workforce, they would have failed miserably. They must produce understanding and committed citizens. But, one might ask, is that not all brainwashing and political indoctrination? It would be if the seeker of knowledge were denied the right to study alternatives and debate them. Authoritarian and totalitarian systems are also committed to educating citizens who support their order, but their students are usually not afforded the right to study alternatives. Today, along with the goals of citizenship, we see an emphasis on the liberal arts and innovation. This is central to Zakaria's defense of the liberal arts. He stresses that Asian societies produce students who test the best internationally in math, but who are not good innovators. The U.S. system, he alleges, produces innovators. To a certain extent, this justification for the liberal arts has displaced the emphasis on citizenship. Being a good innovator is seemingly more important than grasping deep ethical issues, but it does share with liberal arts education a concern for critical thinking and problem solving. It represents the triumph of instrumentalism. In a recent article on Stanford University, the authors stretched the liberal arts philosophy to embrace interdisciplinary study and research which enhances problem solving. I think it is a justifiable stretch, consistent with the notion of modes of learning as central to a liberal arts education. Some of you will remember the aphorism of the Clinton years in the White House. It's the economy, stupid. Whatever it is we want from higher education, it has to be affordable. Jefferson evidently believed that educating informed citizens should be seen as a kind of public good, and even if it were not available to all, it should be paid for by the taxpayer. Many countries in the Middle East, Europe, and elsewhere share that view, but with an emphasis on educating young people for a place in the economy or government. Their education as citizens is of far less importance. So you can ask yourself about the ethics involved. In the Arab world, about 22% of young people between the ages of 18 and 22 go to university or some other tertiary education institution. I note in sadness that because of the quasi-failed states of Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya, that proportion has probably fallen in recent years. The vast majority of the 22% are funded by their governments, which in turn are largely funded by their taxpayers, 3/4 of whom do not send their children to institutions of higher learning. Is this fair? Complicating matters further, the top quintile of income earners is vastly overrepresented in the 22% who do go to universities. As great as the equity problem is, the costs of higher education have everywhere risen much more quickly than the rate of inflation. For many, even meeting the incidental expenses of housing, transportation, food, and books is more than they can afford. Whatever the content of education, the economic model is basically the same. There are large sunk investments in the infrastructure of campuses and real estate. The classic university brings thousands of students, professors, and support personnel together in one place. Paying them, feeding them, overseeing their health while maintaining the university's physical plant is a huge financial cost. Is this model viable? Is this model of a physical university community vital to the future of liberal arts? Many would answer in the affirmative, that what makes a university truly great is the chemistry produced by smart and energetic young coming together with great minds in many disciplines with, of course, the infrastructure to make innovative research possible. But ask yourselves, is that what happens at Cairo University or Mohammed V University in Rabat or Khartoum University? It happens occasionally at Lebanese University, but surely not for most of its 70,000 students scattered across several regional campuses. There are those who say the classic model of fixed seats, credit hours, and physical presence is fundamentally flawed and anachronistic. Probably the most prominent critic is Clayton Christensen of the Harvard Business School. He is not primarily an expert on education. He has made his name in analyzing what he calls disruptive innovation in business. But in the last decade, he has advanced a model for disruptive innovation in higher education. It is called competency-based education. A fundamental characteristic of disruptive innovation is that it can deliver a lower quality substitute for a product that dominates the market. In this instance, the classic campus-based college or university, for a fraction of the prevailing price. What is the logic, or in business jargon, the value proposition of competency-based education? It is instrumental to the nth degree. You pay only for what you get. You don't pay for location, reputation, extracurricular activities, or the football team. Your goal is to acquire competency, and you acquire it at your own pace. You may want to become competent in accounting or in teaching high school biology. You can choose to seek competency in constitutional law or Greek philosophy, but it will cost you money and time. Presumably, only the wealthy would buy competency in the liberal arts. While competency-based education is not incompatible with liberal arts education, I doubt that it will provide a nurturing environment. There is a real irony in this. The democratization of higher education may come at the expense of the liberal arts content. We should welcome democratization however it comes, but not the jettisoning of education for citizenship. Will competency-based education be the wave of the future? It clearly could solve a lot of cost problems. It is supremely compatible with lifelong learning, and it could meet some of the needs of rapidly evolving job markets that require constant retooling. Those of us in the business of more traditional campus-based liberal arts education had better get ready. Christensen suggests that even when established enterprises see the train of disruptive innovation coming down the tracks, they seldom get out of the way. Christensen would not hold out much hope for AUB or Harvard or Oxford to meet this challenge. Let me conclude with a few words on the future of higher education in the Arab world. There will probably be a doubling of the number of students enrolled in tertiary education over the next quarter century. How that I think in real numbers that might be growing from 6 million to 12 million students in higher education. How that expansion will come about is the critical question. Will it be through public or private institutions? What will be its content? What will be its financial models? What will be its infrastructure? I know President Khoury is eager for AUB to play a meaningful role in solving regional problems. It seems to me that AUB is ideally suited to be a catalyst to regional brainstorming and planning. The reconstruction will be the work of generations. Technical expertise will obviously be critical, and it can only come from universities. But more important is the supply of citizens who can help rebuild societies in terms of their institutions and ethical values. I hope we will not drift into this new and daunting era, but rather try to grab hold of it and shape it. Thank you very much. I don't jog much anymore.